Welcome to the broadcast. It was an age of splendor in a tropical dreamland. Swimming pools, showgirls, and a well-dressed casino crowd sipping cocktails to salsa music under the stars. The good life couldn't get better. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind all the velvet ropes and elegance was an ugly underbelly. A world of corrupt politicians, freewheeling fraud, and the U.S. Mafia. Michael Voss introduces us to an award-winning writer who has chronicled the Mafia's role in this enchanted era. They take us along on a walking tour of some of their old haunts in Havana.
Enrique Cirules is one of Cuba's most prolific authors and still going strong. At 74 years old, he's just sent his latest book to the publishers and started researching the next one.
La literatura tiene una ventaja sobre algunos otros oficios. Quiere decir, tiene la ventaja sobre los deportistas. Se supone que cuando un deportista tiene 35 años, ya está entrando en una edad un poco peligrosa. El escritor no. El oficio de escritor, la actividad intelectual, es de un largo alcance, es como el corredor de fondo. Nunca uno termina realmente de alcanzar todas las inquietudes, investigar todas las cosas que promueven el saber y el conocimiento.
His works range from short stories and essays to novels and non-fiction.
This is the book, The Mafia in Havana.
His most famous work is about the Mafia in Havana, which won the Casa de las Americas Prize for Literature in 1993. He's written 2 other books on the subject since then, and another is on the way. With all your research into the Mafia, was there anything that really surprised you?
La gran sorpresa era que nada había sido dejado al azar. Todo formaba parte de un proyecto organizado, dirigido, planificado. Era el proyecto de construir en La Habana un gran imperio delictivo alrededor de la droga, el sexo y el tráfico de oro, el tráfico de diamantes, un gran centro del lavado de fortunas no legalizada en Estados Unidos y un gran centro de juego, de todas las clases de juego en Cuba. Esa fue la gran sorpresa que recibí y además del perfecto entrelazamiento que existió entre el clan Havana Las Vegas, el grupo mafioso dirigido por Meyer Lansky, y el clan del poder aparente de Batista.
General Fulgencio Batista was Cuba's elected president in the early 1940s. He ran again for president in 1952, but when it looked like he'd lose, he seized power in a coup. Washington supported him because of his strong anti-communist stance.
Well, apropos of that, Mr. President, what steps has Cuba taken to combat communism?
Cuba and Russia severed diplomatic relations shortly after my government came into power in 1952.
Cuba in the 1950s was known as America's tropical playground. There were a dozen daily flights from Miami bringing tourists to this exotic and permissive Las Vegas by the sea. Havana offered organized gambling and exotic floor shows with easy access to sex and drugs. Almost all of it was controlled by the Mafia, with approval, help and protection from the Batista regime.
Batista le hacía el trabajo sucio. Ya los mafiosos no necesitaban en La Habana ningún grupo de pistoleros ni de matones. ¿Para qué? Ese trabajo sucio lo hacía Batista.
There are still plenty of reminders of this pre-revolutionary past.
Estábamos en el corazón de La Habana.
Enrique Cirules took me on a walking tour of Havana, past the Capitolio Congress building, where many of the politicians in those days were receiving kickbacks from the Mafia. The building itself is a symbol of just how close Cuba had been to the United States before the revolution.
Ese es el Capitolio de La Habana, construido a imagen y semejanza del Capitolio de Washington. Esa es la sede allí de la Cámara de Representantes y del Senado, en un estado delincuencial en el que todo era permisible, tolerable, perdonable para los grupos mafiosos y muy represivo para todo el resto de la población cubana, a tal extremo que...
Then it was on to the former presidential palace used by Batista and which today houses the Museum of the Revolution. This was the presidential palace. To what extent was Batista in bed with the mafia?
Todo el tiempo yo le decía, sí, en realidad Batista es el hombre que hace toda la apertura de Cuba hacia la entrada de la mafia norteamericana. Se convirtió en un personaje multimillonario. Incluso cada vez tenemos pruebas de que cada vez exigía más dinero. En el primer arreglo le entregan a Batista $3 millones para que le dé la posibilidad de dominar o controlar el casino del Hotel Nacional de Cuba, casi recién inaugurado.
The Hotel Nacional was built in the 1930s and remains one of the most iconic hotels on the island, though its mafia-added casino has long gone. Inside the hotel, there's a small museum with portraits of many of the famous guests who've stayed here over the years, including a whole series of gangster portraits. The Jewish mobster Meyer Lansky, considered the king of the mafia's casino operations, had long made Havana his home. It was Lansky who got permission to expand the Hotel Nacional to include a casino, attracting high rollers from around the world. Lansky developed a close relationship with Batista, who gave him a salary to act as his unofficial Minister of Gambling. Lansky was briefly joined in Cuba by the Sicilian-born Lucky Luciano, the godfather of modern-day organized crime. Luciano was deported from the US to Italy in 1946, but soon resurfaced in Havana.
Y cuando termina la Segunda Guerra Mundial, el gobierno norteamericano, en pago a la ayuda que ha dado la mafia en la Segunda Guerra Mundial, sueltan a Lucky Luciano, que estaba preso y tenía 35 años. Y 3 meses después se da la reunión en el Hotel Nacional de Cuba. No iba a saber la inteligencia norteamericana de Mr. Hoover que ese hotel estuvo cerrado durante 10 días con 500 mafiosos de Estados Unidos para repartirse el problema de la droga, de los territorios, toda esta cosa. Pero además, allí se decidió el problema de Las Vegas.
This was the mob meeting fictionalized in the classic mafia movie Godfather 2. The film was set in the late 1950s, just before Fidel Castro came to power. In reality, the Hotel Nacional meeting was in 1946, when almost all of the major mafia bosses in the US came to Havana to carve out their post-war territories. There was even entertainment laid on, with Frank Sinatra, one of the performers, flown in for the event. These were boom years for Havana, with President Batista and his cronies taking kickbacks for allowing new hotels, casinos and nightclubs to be built throughout the capital. Batista even changed the law to allow anyone who invested $1 million in a new hotel to obtain a gaming license without the need for background checks. Cuba had turned into a country where crooks could earn an honest living. Amongst the new hotels, there was a Hilton, which opened in 1958. It was nationalized shortly afterwards and renamed the Havana Libre, the Free Havana, by Fidel Castro, who made it his temporary headquarters when he triumphantly arrived in Havana in 1959. It was partly the revulsion at the widespread corruption which gave Fidel Castro and his small guerrilla army such widespread popular support. Cuba remains a popular tourist destination, with 2.5 million visitors a year from all over the world except the United States. Amongst the attractions are some of the original bars that were frequented by the mob and other Americans living on the island, such as the writer Ernest Hemingway. Part of the fascination is that Cuba remains trapped in time, with all those classic American cars imported during the 1950s still on the roads. Back then, there was a regular car ferry from Florida, and many of the major U.S. manufacturers had showrooms in Havana, selling tens of thousands of cars to wealthy Cubans and Americans working here. Another leftover from those pre-revolutionary days is the Tropicana, one of the few major original nightclubs which was never shut down. In its heyday in the 1950s, the Tropicana was billed as the largest and most glamorous nightclub on earth. Nat King Cole would fly over from the US to perform here, as would Josephine Baker and the Brazilian star Carmen Miranda. The voluptuous showgirls were known collectively as Las Diosas de Carne, the goddesses of flesh. They set the trend with their sequin and feather musical numbers, later copied in Paris, New York and Las Vegas. Guests included Marlon Brando, Rita Hayworth and Greta Garbo, who all came to watch shows and try their luck at the casino. Juan Carlos Aguilar is the Tropicana's Director of Public Relations.
El casino era una cuestión importante, ¿no?, cuando se va a fundar Tropicana, porque era un sitio tranquilo de La Habana extramuros para jugar, donde las personas pudieran hacerlo y expandirse un poco con el espectáculo también como un complemento de esa necesidad de juego. Recordemos que en los años 50 a Tropicana se le dice Las Vegas del Caribe, a Cuba hasta la Isla del Juego y a Tropicana el Monte Carlo de las Américas, fíjese.
Today, the Tropicana continues to survive and thrive, attracting tourists to its exotic shows. The major difference is that there's no longer any gambling or drugs. All of Enrique Cirules' Mafia books have been translated into several languages and sold throughout the world, including the United States. His prolific writings have brought Enrique Cirules a degree of fame at home and abroad, but not fortune. He maintains a modest lifestyle, living and working out of a small apartment, looking out onto Havana's famous seafront Malecon. He has no plans to stop researching or writing and believes that there's more than enough in Cuba's troubled yet colorful past to keep him busy for some time to come.
Our thanks to Michael Voss for that report.